leadership in the media, although most of them seem to be women. That's odd. We were expecting a male turnout, but what? All right, well, this panel, in the past few years, the issue of gender and women's leadership and position within media has been a hot topic. I think you can't get to a conference on journalism or on media without having this brought up. But this panel maybe is slightly different, because in the past years, and especially after Me Too, a lot of the conversation has been about how women have been victimized, about the weaknesses, about the gaps. And here we'll be addressing the gaps, but we will be addressing them from a position of strength, from a position of women who have already broken through and figuring out how they've done that and what we can learn from that and how we can extend that into structural change within the industry. My name is Fatemah Farag. I am the Regional Director for the Women in News program, WANIFRA's Women in News program in MENA. I am also the founder and director of a local community media company in Egypt. I'm also a board member for the executive committee of WANIFRA and a World Editors Forum board member. I take women's leadership in the media very personally. I'm very, very pleased to have a group of very distinguished media leaders with me here today. All of them who I met, actually not through women's panels, but when attending events on how the industry is changing and who's leading it. And these were the women, among others, who were there. So people who are leading our industry. I will introduce briefly Ritu Kapur, who is the co-founder and CEO of The Quint in India, which is an English and Hindi language website, who leads innovation within her organization. Helje Solberg, who is an award-winning journalist and news director at NPR, MPK in Norway, at the end of the day. And before that was the CEO and editor at BGTV. And in between them both, Inga Thordar, who is the executive editor at CNN Digital International, previously of the BBC. These are just titles, but what I'm going to ask now is each of you to introduce yourself and let us know how it is that you got into the positions that you're in. So if we could start with Ritu.
Hi. I'm hoping that more men come into this room as the conversation carries on. So I've had two avatars of my work life. In the early 90s, I was co-founder of what started off as a production house and was called TV18, and over the next 20 years grew to be India's largest broadcast media network, and was called Network 18. And I had a completely different avatar over those 20 years, because I worked with the presumption that I was a content person, I was a journalist, and that's where my strengths were, and that's what I must do. And there's a lot of other things which must be done by people better qualified to do that than me. So for those 23 years, I stuck to the straight and narrow, and I innovated with content and programming and moved to leadership roles within that. But despite the fact that I was a co-owner, co-founder, co-promoter of the company, I kept a really small profile. I really took pride. I wore it as a badge of honor that very often people in my organization didn't know who I was, or that they just thought I was just one more employee slogging away in a corner. And I, over the years, got surrounded by a number of CEOs in black suits who had the swagger of having known it all, and I would completely not interfere in their decision making. If I had a suggestion to make, I would make the suggestion quietly and not impose myself, and I was constantly told that I was sort of the epitome of humility, and I wore that as well as a badge of honor and did not involve myself, even though I began to see a few things going wrong or things that could be done better, but I completely second-guessed myself and I was hugely underconfident and definitely didn't believe in my ability to do things beyond what I was doing. As things happened, we were first-generation entrepreneurs, were not able to handle the company financially after a point, ran into debt, and we had to exit the company. That's when I went into my second avatar, because that's when we had to start from scratch again. We decided to go from broadcast to digital, and I had to suddenly learn a lot of things. all the black suit CEOs vanished around me. I had to be all of them and more. I had to unlearn everything broadcast and learn everything digital. And then I realized that I needed to understand the financial aspects, the sales, the marketing, the content, of course, the tech as well. And that's when I realized that I could have been doing this all this while. I needed to be the accidental entrepreneur to take charge. And that's been a huge learning for me. And then, of course, the last 4 years has been my other self. And then you realize that, it's just about believing in yourself and not being a victim of what is now called the imposter syndrome, where you believe that, you're sort of pretending to be something that you're not. And that's been my one conversation with all my young colleagues, saying, listen, I wasted 20 years. I could have been doing much more, much earlier. Believe in yourself and believe in the fact that you can be leading.
Great. Inky.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I had a bit of a, I guess, strange sort of entrance into the sort of media world. I always wanted to be a journalist. I'm from Iceland, and I moved to the UK. And I basically got my job at the BBC through an elevator pitch, literally, from 4th floor down to the ground. And by the time I reached the ground, the guy said, sure, I'll give you an opportunity. You can come and work here. We'll give you 3 months, which turned into 15 years. So, that is my one and only successful elevator pitch. I should, say that. So I started in television, and I did television production for many years. And then I sort of, I put my hand up for a lot of things, for field production, for gallery production, for, writing, for, editing the pieces. And, I was given some opportunities, others I didn't get. And there were many that I wished, in hindsight, I had actually, put my hand up for. I then decided to move into digital, and because my skill set was non-existent when it came to digital, I actually had to take a demotion when I moved from television at the BBC into the digital department. And I remember at the time that my editor said to me, you're on a really good track on TV. Why on earth would you do this? Why on earth would you set your career back to move into digital? And I said to him at the time, it was, 2008 or 9 or something. And I said, I truly believe the internet is here to stay. I think this is the future of journalism, and I think this is where I can get more creative. And I mean, he basically said, you have tanked your career, it's finished. Which was an interesting advice to give to somebody who was fairly ambitious and willing to try something new. I've never regretted that decision. But it did mean that I had to sort of almost start again in many ways, which did set back my career. But I don't put that necessarily down to me being a woman, but for the, at that time, inabilities of newsrooms to recognize different skills and diversify the skill sets of newsrooms. I think the other thing that sort of shaped my career there was I did a lot of interviews. I applied for a lot of jobs, didn't get many of those jobs. And I think that is in many ways quite a healthy thing. It was good to get those setbacks. It taught me the resilience, I think, that, is often such a big topic for women, that we don't have that resilience. So I think by not getting a lot of these jobs, I mean, don't get me wrong, I was furious at the time, thought that I should absolutely get them. I was fully entitled to them. All those things, ate, 4 kilos of chocolate when I came home, and all those things that you do. But, sort of when I look back, I think, do you know what, it was quite good. But, on the whole, those panels of those people who didn't hire me were mainly men. It wasn't until in my latter stages that I started having the panels at the BBC got more diverse, and there were, and therefore different decisions were being made around that. But I think that sort of... but then I did definitely come up against certain obstacles, and I think what Ritu describes, even if we're in a very different world, I mean, her in India and me in the UK, I came up across, I was a woman, I was then a foreign woman on top of that, in a very British institution, and that sort of started to, the cultural differences, the gender differences, it definitely sort of, I went into quite a few cul-de-sacs, and by the time I reversed out of, the last one, an opportunity came up at CNN, which I jumped on. And that's been, I was given an opportunity within CNN, which I thought was really exciting, which was basically to build a team from, very little to a very big one within a large organization like CNN. And those opportunities don't come around very often. Normally you're then in a startup where you start and build, and then you have to always worry about your existence and money. Whereas I was in the privileged position of saying, build this team, create something amazing out of it, and you will still have the support of a huge organization like CNN. And to say that I've been on a learning curve since then around, the commercial aspect, which I didn't have at the BBC as much, around American culture, around the corporate American culture, and what that entails, has been an interesting one. But I'm happy to talk about that further, but I think I'll hand over to Helje now.
All right. I fell in love with journalism at an early age, and I've been doing journalism since I was 16. In terms of leadership roles, I, as many women, did not seek it, but I was asked to do it. That happened 21 years ago. I was about to go back to work after being a year home with my oldest child, and I was asked to become the head of the political department. I said no, and because I wanted time with my child, my son, and the editor-in-chief, he did not accept the answer, so he challenged me and asked, what would it take for you to take that job? And that was an interesting exercise. And so after a few days, I went back to him and I told him that, well, I want to go home 2 o'clock twice a week. And he said yes, and this I did for many, many years. And since then I've had many different leadership roles. In spite of challenges and also sacrifices, it has first of all been rewarding and both professionally and personally. I must admit that I have been super traditional in the sense that I have not been proactive regarding leadership roles before quite recently. Last year was the first time I took an initiative myself regarding a job and said, this is a job I want. And then I sent a text message to the Director General of the Norwegian broadcaster and expressed interest in the job I'm currently doing.
Great. Well, let me put this to you. Whenever I talk to male media managers about gender equality within the newsroom, I'm always told that this is not a priority because we are now working within an industry which is facing crisis of journalism, financial crisis, and this cannot possibly be a priority issue. Now, why you, as media managers, would think that this is something that you need to prioritize? And connected to that, where is the bottleneck in the recruitment process that is keeping, although we know that there are quite few numbers of women in newsrooms, but are keeping them from those senior positions? So why you would prioritize it as a media manager, and then again, even though if you did prioritize, what's the problem with the incoming and that process?
And I'm speaking more from an Indian context. I think there is this apprehension that a lot of hiring managers have when they're hiring a young woman in India, which is, there is this, she will get married and she will then be, will have a baby and then she will go into maternity leave. And actually, if you look at statistics in India, you will find that there's actually been an increase in the dropping out of women from the workforce. There is very little that has been done to keep the women in the workforce, whether that's societal in the way the little girl is brought up. She's brought up conditioned that she has to be the good girl who must take charge of the home and family and the child. And so there is an internal conversation that I think a lot of the young women are having with themselves and therefore dropping out of the workplace. And then there is the organizational concern, which sort of echoes, which sort of reflects this internal conversation that the woman is having. As a manager, I think what needs to be done is to have very supportive HR policies, have very supportive, and an insistence. In India, paternity leave doesn't exist virtually. It's not something that is recognized. So to be pushing for things like that, for pushing for creche facilities, I think it's very important to look at everything that is keeping the women away from the workforce and from aspiring to leadership roles. In India, it'd be rare to have a male senior who would have the kind of conversation that Helje Senior had with her. It's unheard of. There would be nobody who would have this conversation saying, what would it take to keep you here? Having said that, I can see that in India now in the editorial roles, there are a number of senior women in leadership roles, and I think that's a good thing, because I think that would, at least that leads to aspiration.
Yeah, I mean, we all agree that there's various crises that we're dealing with in the industry as a whole. But I do think that so many times a lot of these crises come back to diversity or the lack thereof. So, I mean, be that around, you can take Brexit or Grenfell in the UK, you can take, the whole Trump phenomena in the States, the kind of rise of the far right in the Eastern Europe. All of these things are, did we have enough diversity within the media to really identify what was happening? And that's not just gender diversity, it's class diversity, it's urban versus rural diversity and everything. So it is interesting to me, therefore, that when we talk about the business need of media, be it we talk about the revenue side, the KPIs, or any other acronym we find, to me, diversity is just as crucial. It's just as big a need and just as big a crisis for us in the media industry as any other. So I therefore I challenge that sort of notion that diversity is just like one more thing that you have to deal with as part of the crisis. I think diversity in the media is a crisis. And if we don't deal with it, we won't be able to attract the right talent into the industry. We won't be able to tell the stories in the way that we need to tell them in the future. And I mean, you're already seeing a new generation of journalists coming up, and they care about what the organization stands for. They care about it being the gender policies, the environmental policies, or whatever it is. And so I think that, separating somehow diversity and gender issue away from business needs or the crisis is I would definitely challenge that notion, and something that I think is the wrong way to look at it, in my view. To your point about the bottleneck, I mean, both at the BBC, where I did a lot of work around gender diversity, and I'm also sort of starting to see that at CNN now, is that the bottleneck seems to always happen at the same place. There are often more women than men that come in at the entry level into the industry. They then drop off sort of mid-management level. And, there can be plenty of reason for it, but certainly, the point that you say about, having children is a factor, and you might disappear out of the workforce for, in places that do have maternity leave. You can disappear out of the workforce for a year at a time for each child, and then you're missing out quite a bit. And the journalism industry is harsh to come back to. Can you imagine if you're a war field producer and you've got a 6-month at home? I mean, it's like, are you going to disappear into Syria for 3 months? Probably not. So you then and then the industry thinks, well, where do I find a job for you? And then it becomes complex. Flexible working is an issue for us. And I realize that I'm talking here from a Western sort of country's point of view, but flexible working is an issue. Working from home is often an issue because of the technology, and so there are definitely the crunch begins, I would say, at mid-management level, and a lot of women drop out at that point.
Well, first of all, and most importantly, diversity is good for journalism and it's good for business. And we know that diversity is a premise in innovation. If we are all alike, nothing happens. But diversity does not happen by chance. It requires a conscious policy and clearly defined goals. And as managers, we have to be transparent about it, and we have to measure it. Because if we don't measure it, we don't know what the problem is.
What seems to be coming out of this conversation also is that there's a problem with women professionals themselves, that they're reaching a certain point, that there's a structural sort of impediment to their being able to move forward. How can we address something like that, even when we put measures in place? How can we achieve them? Yeah, well, let's start with you, Helje.
All right. No, well, I've been involved in recruitment processes for more than 20 years, and I've had plenty of guys coming to me, which is a good thing, telling me that I'd like to be a leader. Far less women. This might be slightly different with the younger generation, but the overall picture is that there are differences between the genders. Men are better at promoting themselves, and as leaders we must work differently to find and motivate women that are suited for leadership. We must accept that women and men are different. If we insist on treating everyone the same, women will lose out.
I'll have to ask you to explain that, because that's a very loaded step. Could you please tell us what you mean when you say men and women are different and they should be treated differently?
Yeah, no, we just we have to work much harder to find women that are suited for leadership. It's much easier to find men, and so we have to work on giving women more self-confidence to take on leadership roles. Was that answering?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I might probably word it a little bit differently. I don't think that it's harder to find. Their visibility of women is less. I mean, if you look at the sort of overall figure, I think the last figures I saw were that 27% of leadership in newsrooms in Europe is from women. That 27%, that means that more than 70% of newsrooms are led by men. So you're not seeing, so if you come into the industry and there are no women there, I mean, what does that signal to you? And I do think that, that visibility and that sort of promotion of women is hugely important. Having those role models, somebody that you can sort of say, oh, well, there's a path here for me. There's a way here for me. But to the sort of recruitment point, that is definitely an issue. I have worked exceptionally hard to kind of try to build a sort of a succession planning and making sure that my team is as diverse as it can be. But I've often had to, it's not enough for me to advertise, because for every leadership job that I would advertise, I might get the ratio up to 3-to-1 for men and women. So I've had to kind of go out and sort of say, you have to start applying for these jobs. If women aren't applying for them, they won't be considered. And that goes to sort of Helje's point of like, you have to put yourself forward. You have to throw your hat in the ring, and you have to, and as somebody who has not, has gone for many interviews and not got the jobs, it is always worth it. It does send a signal that you're interested, that it does send a signal that, you have an ambition to go somewhere. And if without that signal, people might genuinely just not know. And I think that is also a problem and it goes to that, age-old topic that we talk about around women, which is confidence, and it's like, I would love to see a time when confidence is replaced by resilience, and we're just happy to put our hat in the ring and not get the job, but at least your hat was there, and that is important.
Right. Helje, you wanted to comment on this before?
Yeah, well, I think women more than men tend to make it more a choice for life. So I often tell women, go for it, give it a chance, check it out. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is that you find out that you don't like it. And that's fair enough. Leadership is not for everyone, nor is it the only key to happiness.
Very true. Ritu.
I think it's a confidence issue that needs to be addressed, because just like this underconfidence that stops a lot of young women from applying for jobs, I also find that a number of young women do not diversify on their skill sets. And I'm saying this within, we started the Quint about 4 years back. And when I started off, about 70 to 75% of my newsroom was women. And it was not by choice. It wasn't that I was handpicking and saying, this will be a women-run newsroom. It was just the massive talent pool that was coming in. And I was looking to set up a successful media house. And that's what my concern was. But what I have seen in the last 4 years is that the ratio has come down. And the ratio has come down because in today's media houses, today's media world, you need to be far better equipped in terms of skills. I find that the young ladies in my newsroom do not want to learn a lot of technical skills. They don't want to pick that up. They just want to be the content or the editorial people. They will not pick up camera work. They will not pick up ET editing. They will not pick up coding. They will not try and understand developing or, a lot of those or business skills or marketing skills. And it's very important now, that's a conversation that's around, that given the challenges before media, it's very important for journalists to also understand the business of journalism. And because if you have to grow into leadership roles, you need to arm yourself with much more. And I think it's the confidence issue which comes in and says, listen, and that's what I was talking about. That's what I did to myself for 20 years. And I think that's one of the things that I think as women leaders, we have to be encouraging young people joining the media workforce to diversify with your skills and have, and be aspiring far more aggressively than passively.
Helje, you wanted to?
Yeah, and I think it's especially important to encourage women to take on jobs that are typically male-dominated in the media industry, such as those in technology and strategy.
Well, let's introduce Me Too into this conversation, because that's when we talk about crisis of confidence and visibility of the issue. Me Too brought all this to the fore. It was very empowering. Touched us even in parts of the world where it didn't really make that much of it, but still it framed a lot of this conversation. But would you consider that all of this attention that we've had as a result of this has actually been impactful in the way we do business and in making structural change that we do need to see us being able to address some of the challenges that you've been discussing? Have we had that yet? And if not, what is it that we need to do to be able to translate into that direction?
I think the immediate impact has been strong. I think there's a lot of course correction that has taken place. I think workplaces are definitely going to now be easier or safer for women. I think that's definitely happened. The question now is what next? Because one of the downsides that one fears is that there is going to be, and again I'm speaking more from an India perspective, that there is this almost divisiveness that has happened between men and women in the workplace. There's a lot of apprehension on the one hand. From management point of view, there is, nobody would say it openly, but I've definitely heard the conversation which says, listen, let's try and avoid hiring women because, it's going to spell trouble. I think it's very important, which is why I was hoping there would be more men in this session. It's very important going forward for the conversation to be very inclusive, because one part of Me Too has sort of given us a sense of women are vulnerable and men are either bad sexual predators or they are now scared. I think that's not going to, I think if you have to move towards the next step, it has to be a discourse that involves both men and women and a lot of educating of women and men along with that.
It's interesting. I mean, I would definitely use the same language as Ritu, that this is a course correction. And I think that it is interesting, sort of like when you start hearing this sort of like, oh, women are taking over and everything's about women. It's like, well, no, that is not what is happening here. We should be absolutely clear about that. This is a correction of certain sort of, I mean, in some cases definitely injustices, in some cases just bad decisions, unfairness, or whatever you want to call it. And we're really not quite there yet. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I can understand that, you know, with the Me Too, and it was, I mean, what a movement that was. You know, the pendulum swung very far, and we should expect it to swing back a little bit. But what we have to hope is that it lands in a place where that sort of collaboration, that understanding between men and women is better, and therefore we can take it to the next step. I mean, I think what I sort of noticed in my workplace is that I am exceptionally lucky, I should say, that I work with some incredibly talented women leaders at CNN who don't just sort of challenge me on any of my work, but we stand together in challenging you know, the organization when we don't feel that it's going in the right way. And you know, and I know that is a privilege and exceptional, because many organizations do not have that. But I think it certainly did you know, empower us, and still does, to kind of call out a few things. They might not just be sexual harassment or anything like that, but just sort of like, how are you making decisions? Who's in the room when these decisions are being made? Who are you calling on in meetings to talk about whatever it is? And I mean, you know, I'm pretty capable of talking about Brexit. I have literally lived it now for God knows how long. I have other colleagues who, you know, have better relationship with Trump than they have with their own husbands. And, you know, and I mean, these people are perfectly fakeable of talking about these things. But you start to notice when these things happen. And that, to me, is as much about those unfairnesses and those sort of visibility of women in the workplaces. So I think, you know, having an understanding of that and saying, well, that's not the pendulum swinging all the way to where we certainly live in a women-dominated world, but actually just getting to a good place where men and women are working together in a fair, safe, good space. And I mean, ultimately, that's where we all want to end up, you know.
Me Too was long overdue, and I'm grateful for this movement. That we can speak more, that it's easier to speak more openly about these issues. So I think we will talk about before and after Me Too also in a few years. But even in a fairly egalitarian society such as Norway, we still have huge challenges.
Well, falling back on old habits is also such an easy thing. I was commenting with my relationship to this conference here in Perugia. The first time I was pitching panels at the organizers, they got back to me and they were like, do you notice that you are suggesting all male panels, all men of a certain age and type? You know, I was so taken aback because I did it without even thinking. And so, you know, this idea that you can fall back on old habits is just so easy. Okay, as we're bringing this to a close, could I ask you to give us a takeaway from here? I mean, as we walk out of this room, what is it, one or two points that you really feel are the sort of guiding concepts that we should be walking away with in moving forward? How would you?
You want me to start? Well, it's always that sort of wisdom part that gets to you, isn't it? I mean, I think there's a couple of things for me. I think anyone in the room who is leading a newsroom or leading a team, I would say that, you know, our responsibility is to not pulling the ladder up behind us and paving the way for other women is you know, that responsibility is greater than ever, you know, to build that pipeline of women through any organizations we are, and realizing that our position isn't just, you know, it would have been built on the backs of other, and you know, you want to be the person that someone else who's, you know, your shoulders can be the shoulders that somebody else stands on to reach up to the skies as well. So I would say that, you know, anyone who's in leadership, you know, really take that responsibility seriously. And, you know, the second thing I would say is that, you know, and I know I've said this before, but I do think it bears repeating, is that you have to be in the game to win. And if you stand outside and you don't apply for that job, you don't put your hand up for projects, you know, you don't volunteer for something, you don't, I mean, even going to your boss saying, I am interested in working in X, whatever X is for you. You can't expect people to guess and know what it is. So, you know, just by kind of, you know, articulating what it is that you're interested in, that's how the opportunities open up. So I would really encourage you to find your voice, find anyone to find their voice and really articulate that.
Yeah, I mean, I won't repeat all that she just said, because I think that's really core to it. But I'm just sort of reflecting a little bit on something that I got thinking while this conversation was going on. I think it's also important for us to look beyond the immediate media workspaces. Now, for instance, one of the issues that has stopped women in India from doing formal reporting on Me Too. So there's a lot of sort of calling out people on social media, but it hasn't translated into real action because they haven't formally gone to the courts. That's because they're largely men sitting in judgment in the court. It's largely men in the police stations, and our legal processes are extremely tedious, and they will drag out for 10 or 12 years. There will be a lot of victim shaming. So there is, I don't know how to say it, but I think through the media, as more women are coming in, I think there needs to be much more reporting on women's issues than is happening, rather than just, sort of isolated as and slot it and box it as this is Me Too, we will report on Me Too. I think this flowing into all other aspects of structure, the way society is structured. For instance, in India, we're still arguing and debating and fighting and pleading for 33% representation of women in the parliament, whereas 50% of the population is women. So it's I know this is sort of wishful thinking, and I could leave this at, of course, I think it's important for all of us to be mentoring the younger women in the workspaces, to be groomed as leadership, to give them all our learnings and our mistakes, and to do all that Inki just spoke about. But I think the importance is for all of us as journalists to be actually addressing some of these issues which are not addressed enough in the media.
Diversity is simply the right thing to do. I think we see it again and again, and now I'm talking about diversity in a broader sense than only gender. But magic happens when we put different people together.
The right thing to do. I like that. All right, we have a few minutes for questions. Who has the microphone? Do we have a microphone? Yes? Shall we start at the back? The young lady, please.
Hi, a question for Helje. Hi, first of all. I was impressed by, you were talking about sort of the first big chance you were given, or maybe the first big chance when you didn't want it was when you had your child and your boss said, look, what would it take? And your boss took a chance on you and said, okay, you can work essentially 2 half days a week. That's very complicated for a manager. It's a very hard thing to manage, right, when you have a team and you can let your team not work full time. Is this something that you now do with your own teams now that you manage a lot of people, or encourage other managers to do? Because it's very complicated.
Yeah, and it's not in all jobs you can do that. But I also think that my boss, he was confident that I was not going to work part-time. I worked more than 100%, but he gave me more flexibility.
All right. Also, back here, we'll work our way to the front.
Hi there. I see that you're all in the midst of your career, but what advice do you give to young millennial women who want a leadership position someday?
Just do it.
There you go.
It's a good experience.
We're all happy. All right. Back here, and then moving forward, we have 2 questions.
It's Peter Jepsen from Germany. I'm always a little bit frustrated about such discussions because to me it feels like preaching to the already convinced. So the question is, what can we all do so that more men are present at such a discussion next year in Perugia?
Yeah.
I would actually love to ask you that. What can we possibly do? Because I know that you're absolutely right. We've had these discussions, and I'm pretty sure that there are not many women here who think that there should be less women in leadership. So I'm going to almost take that as a given. So, I mean, to Helje's point, great things happen when diverse people are in the room. We can absolutely not say that there's diversity in this room right now. I mean, I think that the real change, a massive change will come when everyone becomes engaged. And but for some reason, and I'm still, struggling a little bit with the reason why, men aren't willing to engage in this sort of conversation and understanding it. And I think, I mean, part of it could be fear, and we really want to create a welcoming space and an open space to have this debate. But you know, for some reason, I don't think that has sort of quite happened yet. But thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate that.
Yes, we have.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the advice you give is very good in theory. But how do you reconcile the conflicting demands of parenthood and those of leadership? Because that's a big issue, and that is why many women, they drop out in their mid-career. Because it is an unsolvable conflict in the current structure of the workplace.
I think it's important to have policies which enable women to stay in the workplace. Let's presume that the primary burden of parenthood will fall on the woman. Let's not try and challenge everything. Eventually we should. But I think as women leaders, or as, you know, people who are supporting other women in workplaces, you don't only have to be a woman leader. I think facilities you have to build those things into your business model, because like Helje said, that having women at work is good business. If that is recognized as true, then I think you have to have the creches and the good maternity policies and the kind of flexibility at work hours. I think that has to be the start. That's
Helje.
Do you favor your child going to the doctor or the boardroom meeting if it's at the same time?
That's the flexibility that I'm talking about. And now, actually, in my newsroom, I find that there are a lot of the men employees who are also taking time off to take the kid to the doctor, and you encourage that. There was a time that there would be. I have heard other colleagues, senior colleagues, say, "Why does he have to be taking time off because he has to take this?" And that's the thinking that needs to be corrected as well, because there's a lot of pressure on the men to not do these parenting things.
Helje, you wanted to comment on that?
Well, I think we have a huge responsibility to make it possible to have a life beside your job. And if a management job is experienced as just a big sacrifice, we will lose some of the very best people. And in my experience, employees with young kids, they are so structured, and they are good employees. And that would never be a condition to not choose someone to a management position.
I can give you, I've got 2 kids, and it was really funny to me when I had my kids. I was in quite a unique position. So my husband worked in the same department, in the same company, and we had the same kids, right? He was given opportunities, and I didn't. And when I said, "Hey, I would like to be doing that," and they said, "Well, it's really difficult when you keep going off having babies." And I had to point out to them that he had them too, and that his responsibility was just as great as mine. And they sort of stood there and looked at me, and they were like, and I said, "I literally have a perfect case study here, of 2 people in the same department treated very differently, absolutely based on gender, And, and I think it was a bit of a wake-up call for my manager at the time. But I think that, to answer your question directly, you make a decision that is right for you. And your company should respect that. Because if you make the decision that's right for you, you're likely to make the right decision for the company. And I think that that's the kind of, understanding that we have to get into the business. I mean, I wouldn't trust you if you didn't take your kids to the doctor and decided to stay in the boardroom instead. I would think, what kind of decision is that person, man or woman, going to take in that boardroom? And so I think that that's the sort of, no company barely, and again, I know I'm speaking from a privilege of a very big organization, but no company relies on just one person. Normally that is something that you can catch up on, you can find other ways of doing it. But you have to make the right decision for you, otherwise you won't be, you won't be happy in your job, you won't be right in the job, and therefore the company won't go as well.
Okay, we have a question here, and then Courtney, and then we'll move to this side.
Hi, in the first half of the conversation, you had talked a lot about being more resilient and being more confident.
and also like diversifying skill sets. But a lot of those things tend to be because of cultural upbringings, and people, women especially, tend to be less confident because they've been taught so that, okay, you cannot do this. Especially like, for example, if you take coding and technical skills, a lot of the times girls grow up listening to the fact that, okay, you can, like, girls are not good at coding, girls are not good at technical, but you should be creative and write well. I mean, I'm just paraphrasing here because I kind of have been on the receiving end of such conversations, but how would you tackle those kind of, that cultural side of things where growing up you hear such things, and at a certain point of time it is going to impact you in some way or the another. So like, how would you tackle that kind of a mindset where you have women around you who are talented and who can actually, you know, code well or do things, but they believe that they cannot? Like, what would your solution be to that, or your way to tackle that?
You know, I think a lot of what you said would have been true for a few generations before, but I think today's generations, I mean, your age, you're exposed not just to what your parents are telling you or what your family is telling you. You're reading, you're exposed to so much else. I think you have to, I can understand up to a certain age, but after a certain, you have to be able to think for yourself. And I think that's the only way you can address that.
Really quick, also, I think along with not applying for jobs, they don't apply for fellowships. Like the International Women's Media Foundation has to beg women to apply, so everyone should apply here. But my question to you is, how about women who decide not to have families, who decide to prioritize their career? Is it fair to put that out there? And what about, how do you rise in the field if you don't want to be in management? You want to keep doing the thing, but there's not a lot of way to rise and keep doing the thing. You have to get into management.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I hear what you mean, because actually the tech companies have done that pretty well. You know, if you're sort of on the product side or the engineering side, you can rise up the company without going into sort of management as such. So, I mean, this is kind of a conversation that I've had a bit in my department, and other departments at CNN have done this better than we've been able to. But I think creating different pathways through companies is absolutely critical right now. I think that the workforce that is coming in now expects very different ways of working than, you know, we might have done when we sort of entered the business. So this idea of a better flexibility about saying, you know, I don't want to be a manager, I want to be a sort of a writer, and how do I rise up the rank as a writer, or how do I rise up the rank as a field producer or something, and not only always stay at the bottom rank because that's where those jobs were valued at before. I do think that there is a rethink that has to be done in a lot of media companies now around how we value each job as well. You know, I mean, I think it's really interesting that, you know, and it sort of goes to your point that the sort of tech jobs and the coding or something are valued often higher, you know, than other jobs. So, I mean, for example, if you're a cameraman and you can sort of, you know, shoot beautiful pictures and press buttons, that is more highly valued than if you're sitting on the desk as the senior news editor, you know, keeping teams on the go for 24 hours, you know, telling them to just do that one more hit. Come on, guys, you can do this, you know, keeping the morale. But for some reason, there's this sort of difference between how these jobs are valued. And if you don't go into that one stream, certainly you're not sort of, you know, that somehow your role isn't as big. So I think that, you know, the rethink isn't just about sort of we need more women here and more, you know, ethnic diversity here or something. It's like, it's a rethink of how do we actually value each job. And certainly in sort of broadcast organizations where we don't have that sort of columnist path for journalists that you used to have in the papers in the old days, where you weren't a manager, but you were one of the most senior persons in the newsroom. I think we have to start rethinking that sort of path for people so that they can stay within their skill set and yet, you know, continue to increase their value inside the organization. And I don't think management is necessarily always the right barometer or measurement for that.
Anybody else? We're good? All right. We have a question here, and I'll take one question after that. And
hi, so I'm Hannah. I'm also from India, so my question is mainly to Ritu Kapur and the rest of the panel, of course. So it's mildly related to what she was asking, but basically the society where we come from, broadly speaking, like she said, looks at women as the domestic caretakers. And they don't see an opportunity of like, they don't see that they can be ambitious. They just see themselves working in a kitchen. It's like when you're writing your 11th grade exams and your classmates tell you, why should I study when I know I'm just going to be cutting vegetables 5 years later? So what do you think we can do to show women that they have the opportunity, despite the cultural bubble that we're still living in, even though the rest of the world has moved on, like, I don't know, ages ago. So what do you think we can do to show women that, you know, there are people like you who have been successful, who are ambitious and have achieved their dreams?
I think now in India there's so many role models, you know, which our generation didn't have as many to look up to. I think that the cultural bubble has to be poked. The initiative will need to be taken by the women themselves. It's not something, you can't wait for something to change externally, because then you will be waiting forever, right? It's like Helje said, just do it. You have the advantage of being exposed to an environment like this, for instance. I'm sure there's a lot that you could be sharing with a lot of other young Indian girls that you're exposed to. So this has to come, just like the Me Too movement. They didn't wait for an external, it just happened, right? And there was a lot of women supporting each other through that. So I think if you do that, if you take the initiative, and there's a lot of support, I think the onus is on a lot of us, whether we're in leadership roles or we're peers, to actually support that. I think the Me Too movement has actually is a sort of a case study on how that can happen.
Okay, our final question. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for having this panel to start off with. I myself have been in leadership positions for about 10 years now, and I work in a newsroom where I'd say I'm pretty lucky. We have pretty much half of the leaders in the newsroom are women. So on the surface, everything is just fine. Yet I noticed that still women are heard less than men, that if we are in big meetings, generally men are listened to for longer. I noticed that the senior management, which are all men, I know that they value my expertise, but yet they go off and kind of make the decisions, and then they come back and say like, oh yeah, we've made this decision, and we really want to hear your opinion before we communicate it. And then I'll be like, yeah, I don't think it's the right decision to take right now because of this and that and that and that. And then they're like, oh yeah, right. And then they won't communicate it, and then a month later they were like, oh yeah, so we want to communicate something, and come back with exactly the same plan. So how do you cope with that?
Do you want me to start?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think your experience is any different from most women in leadership, to be honest. There is a big difference between counting women or pointing to how this is how many women I have, and actually listening to their viewpoints and what they have to say, and taking that into account. And I do believe that is the next big fight. It's the sort of like, you know, yes, we are here and now we would like to be heard, please. You know, you know, and it's kind of funny, you know, it is still sort of like a little bit about, oh yeah, we're going to discuss diversity at this board meeting. Well, Inki, what do you think? And I'm like, all right. You know, so it's that sort of like that you're kind of put into a certain bracket, you know, about what you discuss. But so I think part of that reason, part of the solution to that is, you know, goes a little bit to those point about sort of just do it. It's like, just start speaking up, and then when, you know, when this happens, and I know that this happens, I've heard countless anecdotes. You say something, and a man repeats it, and they're like, hey, that's a good idea. So, but then have the bravery to say, thank you for making my point, I really appreciate that, I agree with you, you know. And then sort of, it's that sort of calling it out a little bit, you know, and, as I said, you know, and this goes back to my, my support network at CNN, is that we also do that for other women. Is that sort of like, when you hear that, it's saying, yeah, that's exactly what so-and-so said, that's great. Yes, there's a support for that, I think. So I think that's sort of, you know, one thing. And then also speaking up outside that bubble of what women are supposed to know about, I think is hugely important. And I have also been speaking a lot to our sort of senior management about saying, when you're asking people in that meeting, think about who's in that room. Who is in that room when these decisions are being made? If they are 90% men and white, you're probably not going to make the best decision for this company for the future. So just, you know, I said if you do nothing else but to look around and say, is the right makeup of people in this room? If you're talking about the gender pay gap and you're all men, chances are that you will not get all viewpoints. So I was like, please think about who's in the room when it's said, and then listen to that. I mean, I think that we all have to start getting a bit better about calling that out.
No, your experience is, of course, not unique, and this is structure. And it doesn't start at work. It starts at home, almost at birth. Did you know that parents of boys are more likely to search on Google, "Is my child a genius?"
All right then, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a great, great session, for everything that they represent.